Folks, good evening. Welcome to Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. My name is Emily Levine. It is wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for gathering with us for this wonderful presentation. Many of you are familiar with this site by way of review, and welcome for those who aren't. I'll tell you just briefly about logistics for this evening. Restrooms are available in the House Visitor Center, so what you need to do is just slip out this door, head over to the back of the big yellow house. Door there is open for a couple of single restrooms. We will be kicking off our presentation with Professor Lisong Liu in just a couple of moments. He will present, followed by a Q&A, and we should be wrapping up roughly around 7:15, depending on questions, conversation. We look forward to that. We'd like to also extend our thank you to the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, for their ongoing support of this speaker series and many other programs at the Longfellow House. We hope you'll join us on April 27th, Sunday afternoon, for Poets in the Garden with Tony B. and illustrator Equa Holmes. And the speaker series for this fall, winter, spring is going to conclude on May 2nd with the premiere of our new 14-minute part film, which is titled The Past and Present Here Unite, followed by a Q&A with filmmaker Peter Argentine. Folks can register for that and other things on our website, and we hope that you will come visit the house itself starting May 23rd for our public season. We are also getting ready for poetry, music, community events, our Summer Arts Festival on May as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Lisong Liu is a professor of history at Massachusetts College of Art and Design and specializes in Chinese migration, Asian American history, and U.S. China relations. He is also an associate in research at Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and a member of the International Advisory Committee for the Chinese Heritage Center at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is currently working on a book on the history of Chinese cultural presence and migrant experience in Boston. He is also a past Patterson Research Fellow, which is a fellowship sponsored by the Friends of the Longfellow House. This fellowship advances and supports scholarly research and projects using the site's archives and museum collections. So thank you so much for speaking with us tonight and for sharing your really fascinating and timely research this evening. It is always extra exciting when we get to feature current research that took place, at least in part, in connection with the collections here on site. So welcome. Thank you, Lisong.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your kind introduction. I'm so honored to be here, sharing my research with you based on my archival research at Longfellow House and Washington's headquarters National Historical Site. Thanks to the Friends of Longfellow House for offering the fellowship and the opportunity to study the archives, and a special thanks to Patricia. Thanks for your support from the very beginning when you reached out to me about this fellowship and providing all kinds of suggestions and support for my research. And a special thanks to Kate Anson for I know you're not here, but I know you will watch the video later. Thank you for your kind support. The best support I could really imagine in any archival research, because you not just very patiently let me downstairs every time, open the door, leading me downstairs to the office, but also even going above and beyond by helping me read some of the letters, which I found it very hard to tell the handwritings. So thank you, Kate. I also want to thank the other Longfellow House and the Washington headquarters Historical Site staff members for all your kind support. I'm also fortunate to get to know the Burlingame family members during my research, especially Barbara, Jack, and Lucy. I know Jack, Lucy, and Jane, you are here today. Thank you for coming. And Barbara, you're not here, but I hope you can watch and enjoy the video later. And also, congratulations on your soon-to-be published paper on Anson Burlingame. And also, I want to thank Sarah Lawson from Harvard Art Museum, because she was very supportive for my research, this particular research project, and also Professor Zhichun Zhu at Bucknell University, who was also supportive of this research. And thanks, of course, to everyone for coming. Okay, I will get it started. I will, of course, start with the fan, the beautiful fan that started this whole research project. It was October 30th, 1865. Henry Longfellow wrote in his diary, "Give a dinner to Mr. and Mrs. Anson Burlingame in honor of the Chinese fan sent me by a mandarin with the Song of Life written upon it in Chinese. Guests Mr. and Mrs. Burlingame, John Gorham, Palfrey, Sumner, and Thema, the original free soilers." And here are the people at the dinner table. The poem was translated by this Vice Foreign Minister in China at the time, Dong Xun. He translated it and also inscribed it on the fan. And then Henry Longfellow and Anson Burlingame and John Palfrey and Richard Thema. I tried very hard to find a photo of Mrs. Burlingame. I couldn't somehow online, so maybe in the future you can help me. For this talk, my main questions are how this group of prominent American intellectuals and anti-slavery activists got to connect with China in this particular way, what China meant to them, and how the image of China in the United States changed in the 19th century. Scholars have studied the American perceptions of China, and they often view the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 as the turning point of the image of China from being respected and admired to being despised. However, this can't fully explain the responses to the Opium War, at least by many educated Americans who sympathized with China and criticized the illegal opium trade. It also cannot explain the cordial reception of the Chinese embassy by Anson Burlingame in 1868, particularly here in Boston. So I hope my study helps us better understand the complexity of American perceptions of China, particularly after the First Opium War up to the 1880s, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Historians have also discussed the role of three main groups of Americans, often hailing from Boston and the New England area, in constructing the image of China and the Chinese in the 19th century. In fact, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Merchants, missionaries, and diplomats. This helps revise the historiography of Chinese and Asian American studies that often focuses on the West Coast and viewed it as the origin and the main cause for the anti-Chinese movement later swept the nation and led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So historians studying the role of merchants, missionaries, diplomats from the East Coast have pointed out that the California conspiracy theory, the so-called California conspiracy theory, is not totally accurate or satisfactory because there had been deep roots of biases against the Chinese on the East Coast, which had a longer history than the West Coast, of course, as we know, of trading with China, sending missionaries there, and receiving Chinese travelers and migrants. So my study here hopes to continue this investigation of the role of the East Coast in shaping the image of China, though I will study the decades after the Opium War and focus on a group of American intellectuals, including those devoted abolitionists, such as the members of the dinner party at the Longfellow's house here in 1865, to show both the inherited and the subtle biases and the deep commitment and active efforts to enhance racial justice and international collaboration. My study will draw on three main types of sources. The archival research here at the Longfellow House, such as the family letters of Henry Longfellow, Fanny Longfellow, and Charlie Longfellow. I will also use the writings by or about their friends, such as Burlingame and Athena. In addition, my talk will rely on a careful study of the North American Review, the leading literary journal in the United States, founded in 1815 and still existed now. It was based in Boston in most of the 19th century, in fact. And Longfellow and his friends constantly contributed to that journal. So a systematic study of this discovery of China and the Chinese migrants during the 1840s and 1880s will help us place my discussion of individual letters and the writings of Longfellow and his associates in a broader intellectual and cultural context, and it helps us see the patterns of the shifting image of China in the second half of the 19th century. Another main theme I hope to highlight in this talk is the voice of the Chinese themselves, which have often been left out in the study of American perceptions of China. However, if we pay enough attention and try hard, we can find their resilient voices. The fan is a good example. The fan that the Chinese scholar official gifted Longfellow can be viewed as an active attempt of the Chinese in reaching out and building a bridge between the two nations. I will also introduce some other examples, such as the first Chinese professor at Harvard, who also reached out to Longfellow, and his photo, in fact, is here, preserved at the Longfellow House. And I will also use two articles published in the North American Review written by two Chinese authors in the 1880s to show how they responded to the American mistreatment of the Chinese and the stereotype of China. All right. My talk will be divided into three sections, following the chronological order. First, I will talk about how Longfellow family members responded to ex-President John Quincy Adams' view on the Opium War and the general perceptions of China during the 1840s and the 1850s. Then I will focus on the Burlingame mission and a few other examples to understand the image of China in the 1860s and the early 1870s. Finally, I will talk about the fast deteriorating image of China in the mid-1870s and then the 1880s, hinged on the so-called Chinese question, as well as the voices of the Chinese themselves. On November 26, Fanny Longfellow wrote to her close friend Emily Wadsworth, describing a lecture she just attended. I was immersed in a sea of text, listening to ex-President Adams holding forth in a brown nightcap and with his usual vehemence of tone upon the Chinese war, putting the question upon exactly opposite ground to the expectation and opinion of all his hearers, as he always delights to do, having an indomitable love of opposition, for to nothing else could we attribute, in this case, his absurd theory on that matter. Fanny was referring to former President and then a House Representative John Quincy Adams' infamous speech on the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, when China banned the opium trade and Great Britain declared war on China. Adams blamed the Chinese for the war and argued that the British were justified in launching the war due to China's mistreatment of other nations, disallowing free trade and violating the Christian principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. The public speech was delivered at the Masonic Temple on behalf of the Massachusetts Historical Society on November 22nd, 1841. John Pelfrey, one of the free soilers invited by Longfellow to the dinner party, and then the editor of the North American Review, initially invited Adams to write on this subject and intended to publish the speech in the North American Review. However, with Adams' shocking argument, Pelfrey deemed it inappropriate to publish it without more comprehensive deliberations on the all-important practical point that Adams promised to include in the speech, and that would be important for readers to understand how he reached his conclusion. The response of Fanny, Longfellow, and Pelfrey to Adams' speech revealed the general discontent among the educated class in Boston with British invasion of China and with the illegal and unethical opium trade. The anti-opium war stance of the North American Review was aligned with its moral principles. In its review of Boston merchant Robert Bennett Forbes' book on China and the China trade, published in 1844, the North American Review highlighted the value of this book from a sensible and a well-informed merchant based on his intimate experience in China, offering interesting facts and educating the public without scant knowledge of China. However, it pointed out that the briefly mentioned opium trade in the book was treated only as a great commercial and a political question, its moral aspect in relation both to the consumers and to the parties who bring it to China being left entirely out of view. So it's a very sharp criticism of Forbes' account. While as admonishing the illegal and immoral opium trade, the North American Review did praise the role of merchants, diplomats, and missionaries in promoting progress and civilization, and in that process, reinforced the stereotypes of China as traditional, stationary, and backward. In 1848, the North American Review reviewed the journal of Major Samuel Shore, the first American consul at the continent, compiled by Josiah Quincy. It praised Shore in Quincy's words as a person, quote, uniting more intimately the qualities of the gentleman, the soldier, the scholar, and the Christian, end quote. Shore's account of his life in China in the 1780s were still useful in the 1840s, according to the North American Review. Although the intercourse of half a century intervening since they were written may have made that which was once novel now familiar, referring to China for the Americans. Yet, from the unchangeableness of Chinese habits and policy, they undoubtedly contain much information which, even at this day, is both useful and attractive. So again, it highlighted the unchangeableness of the Chinese habits and policy. The same year of 1848 witnessed the publication of the American missionary Samuel Williams' comprehensive study of China, and the North American Review offered a glowing evaluation of this work, over 5 times the length of the other 2 reviews I just mentioned, of Forbes and Shore. And this one was 5 times longer, this review. With particular praise of the role of Christianity in exploring this foreign country, China, and enumerating its path to civilization. But in a merely geographical and historical aspect, China presents the strongest claim on the interest of the Western world, the reviewer wrote. The most interesting aspect was how it related to the philosophy of human progress. China was the highest stage of civilization which has as yet been attained by any nation independently of Christian institutions. Then, why had China been stationary during ages so fruitful of changes for the rest of mankind? What were the great deficiencies in Chinese civilization? The reviewer cited several, such as the lack of speculation and spiritual philosophy that generated the modern inventions and the discoveries in Christian nations, and the barrier of the Chinese language against the increase of knowledge. Offering copious extracts from Williams' book, the North American Review claimed that, quote, we agree with our author that Christianity is the one thing that they need as an inspirer of self-respect, as a stimulant to their dormant energies, as the emancipator of women from their thraldom, as a guide and a helper in the duties and amenities of domestic and social life. End of quote. In 1856, the North American Review reviewed the memoir of Thomas Hadassah Perkins, another pioneering Boston merchant in the China trade. Compared with the review of Forbes' account 8 years ago, what's striking was the conspicuous absence of any mention of opium in the review. Even though Perkins was known for his participation in the opium trade, instead, the review highlighted the importance of commerce in advancing civilization and Perkins' role as the major benefactor for numerous philanthropic projects and civic institutions in Boston. Quote, commerce is now the chief aspect, the controlling power, the paramount interest of the civilized world, and its comparative ascendancy in the several nations of Christendom might, with little error, be assumed as the type and the gauge of their respective measures of civilization. End of quote. One reason for downplaying and omitting opium in this review could be that it was 1856, no longer the 1840s during the First Opium War, when the opium trade was the primary cause for the war, and the memory of the opium trade was still, well, the experience with the opium trade was very prominent in public discussions. Though the Second Opium War was launched in 1856 between China and Great Britain and France from 1856 up to 1860, the opium trade was not the only or the immediate cause for this Second Opium War. Another important reason could be the political context in the U.S., the need to promote commerce as a progressive force in addressing economic and political crises in the United States, both North and South. As the review highlighted, it could advance national wealth and compete effectively against aristocracy, including the South against the plantation owners. It could be a neutral but liberating and possibly unifying force for the nation that was mired in a political crisis on the slavery question and would soon suffer a bloody civil war. So the second section, the oldest empire is the youngest republic, from 1860s to the early 1870s. The 1860s was a watershed for both nations, both starting with seemingly unsurmountable perils, yet proceeding with new hopes and opportunities. The United States plunged into the Civil War, but bounced back with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, establishing birthright citizenship, due process of law, and the constitutional protection of voting rights, regardless of race, color, or previous enslavement. In China, the Second Opium War ended in 1860. Then, though foreign influence was deepened under the new unequal treaties, it was a time with relatively stable relationships between the Qing government and the foreign powers. The devastating civil war in China, the Taiping Rebellion, came to an end in 1864. Though with unprecedented devastation, the Qing government survived and proceeded with the self-strengthening movement, including founding the foreign ministry in 1861. Well, that's related to the fan, because the person who translated the Longfellow's poem and wrote the poem on the fan was a newly appointed official in this newly established foreign ministry, which was just established in 1861. And the fan was Senator Longfellow in 1865. So you see, it's very close. And in the United States, Longfellow, Burlingame was appointed by President Lincoln as the American minister to China in 1861, and gained China's trust, and was later invited by China to lead a Chinese mission to tour the West and seek better treaties. In this tumultuous but hopeful time, liberal American intellectuals viewed China with sympathy and respect. One of the Longfellow's dinner party participants, Richard Dana, right here on the screen, he traveled around the world and visited China in 1860 before he returned to the U.S. and was appointed by President Lincoln as the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts. In his journal, unpublished until 1891, in the Atlantic Monthly, he observed how privileged Westerners traveled in China and bullied the Chinese. He praised the Chinese people and their traditions, recorded women's hardships, and appreciated the treatment by local Chinese officials who were urbane and courteous and showed both curiosity and knowledge about the West. Of course, Burlingame, his appointment as the Chinese ambassador and his successful negotiation with the U.S. for the Burlingame Seaworld Treaty in 1868 best symbolized the potential and the benefit of U.S. China friendship and cooperation in the 1860s. It established the principles of reciprocity and equality between the two countries, promising the right of Chinese to free migration and a permanent residence settlement in the U.S., and guaranteeing their protection under the most favored nation status. Citizens of each nation could also have the equal access to education when living in the other country, and China was also protected from undue foreign intervention. It was the first equal treaty China signed after the Opium Wars, and was designed as a model for the treaties China was about to sign with other powers. The Burlingame delegation was received with great enthusiasm in Boston. In a reception hosted by the Boston City Council, Mayor Nathaniel Shurtleff remarked that this was a historical moment when the greatest, the most populous, and the most ancient of all the nations of the world shall open most widely and most freely her hitherto closed portals to all people of all lands and of all complexions and of tongues. Thanking the mayor's cordial greeting, Burlingame challenged the stereotypes of China as despotic and bigoted, and elaborated on the similarities between China and the United States, not just in physical traces, but also across a range of institutional and cultural spheres. So that's his statement at the reception. They have moral and political relations of a similar character with ours. China is divided into provinces as this country is divided into states. The Chinese hold to the great doctrine that the people are the source of power. You vote by ballot. In China, they vote by competitive examination. You shout when your fellow citizens is elected. They shout when their scholar has received his degree. They are scornful of caste, and so are you. You tolerate every faith, and so do they. You proceed to make a law by petition. They proceed by memorial. Burlingame mentioned the scholar official Dong Xun, who translated Longfellow's poem, the first secular poem ever translated into the Chinese language. And Burlingame emphasized that Dong's personal life also showed the Chinese virtue of valuing education and merit, because Dong himself was once a poor school teacher. So the two peoples, Americans, Chinese, do have a lot to learn from each other, according to him. Senator Charles Sumner, of course, another participant in the dinner party, was present in the reception, and he expressed his heartfelt rejoice of his close friend's historic achievement. Burlingame sent to China as a foreigner, but returned with his highest trusts and dignities. Once the representative of a single congressional district, he now represents the most populous nation of the globe, as Sumner said. Once the representative of little more than a third part of Boston, he is now the representative of more than a third part of the human race. Sumner compared Burlingame to Marco Polo. The Venetian Marco Polo returned from Peking westward, while our Marco Polo returned home from Peking eastward. This change is typical of that transcendent revolution, and whose influence the Orient will become the Occident. In his speech, Ralph Emerson described the special occasions that meet between the oldest empire and the youngest republic. Recognizing that China had been a romantic legend to most of us, Emerson noted that this venerable Oriental dynasty suddenly steps into the fellowship of nations. Together with the recent reforms in Japan, China's outreach marked a new era and is an irresistible result of the science, which has given us the power of spin and the electric telegraph. While praising China's old civilization and portraying it in a positive light, Emerson and many other speakers at the reception still adopted the binary framework that posited China in contrast to modern Western nations, symbolized by the United States, the youngest republic, leading the world with modern science and stimulating and undergirding the old civilizations as they enter the modern age. When Burlingame led the Chinese delegation to the United States and stayed in Boston, Longfellow and his family were traveling in Europe. He met Burlingame when his Chinese mission delegation went to Europe to proceed with the treaties with European powers. Though not directly involved in state affairs related to China, Longfellow lent support to his friends. Not just Burlingame, but Sumner, when they strived for better treatment of China and the Chinese. So here's a letter. In 1870, when Congress was debating the naturalization law, Longfellow wrote to his friend George Washington Greene that I wish the lazy Congress would rise and let Sumner loose. I agree with him about the Chinese and about striking the word white out of every law of the land. Longfellow was referring to Sumner's proposal in July 1870 as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that any surplus remaining of the Chinese Indemnity Fund after fair claims should be returned to China. The same year, Sumner also moved an amendment to the naturalization law, that all acts of Congress relating to naturalization be and the same are hereby amended by striking out the word white wherever it occurs, so that in naturalization there should be no distinction of race or color. The amendment was initially passed. However, strong opposition remained, and Senator George Williams of Oregon proposed another amendment to explicitly prohibiting Chinese immigrants from naturalization, describing them as unassimilable and posing a threat to the American Republic by establishing an empire of China within the North American Republic. Sumner's amendment was eventually rejected on July 4, 1870. And the 1870 naturalization law mainly extended the right to naturalization to the people of African nativity or African descent, in addition to white persons who were already specified in the original naturalization law in the 1790s. This extension was a recognition of the end of slavery and the 14th Amendment that secured birthright citizenship of African Americans. It was also based on practical reasons, as Africans, especially those in the United States, were deemed more assimilable with smaller numbers and also with the potential benefits to the Republican Party. Sumner's failure in 1870 was an indication of the surging sentiments and hatred against the Chinese migrants and the growing fear of China and the Yellow Peril in the late 19th century. The Burlingame Treaty itself was abrogated in 1880. As a scholar points out, its unraveling resonated with the failure of the Reconstruction in the United States. With the tightened Jim Crow laws in the South and with the surging anti-Chinese sentiment and riots, the image of China further deteriorated along with the status of the Chinese in the United States. We'll try to be quick. I know it's already 6:36. So the last section, the Chinese question and Chinese voices, early 1870s to the 1880s. We can start this section with Charlie Longfellow's diary during his visit to China to explore the intricate images of China in the 1870s. The oldest son of a Longfellow family, Charlie served in the army during the Civil War and was injured. Always a man of action with a keen interest in distant places, he traveled around the world, including visiting Japan for 20 months in 1871 to 1872, and then China, about 3 months in 1873. Ironically, compared to his fond memory of Japan, his description of China was particularly dark and depressing. Starting with his arrival at Shanghai on April 4, 1873. As his ship sailed through the river, he wrote, "On shore there was nothing to be seen as far as the eye could reach, but a flat, brown country, literally covered with mounds of dead Chinamen, and here and there a small farmhouse or clump of bamboos. It seemed as if one was passing through one vast graveyard." Even though he met and parted with fellow Americans and other European travelers with status and privilege, he wrote that this gaiety is all very well in its way, but it gives me back my quiet, free life in Japan. Charlie marked the backwardness of the Chinese in their military technology, and he found the Chinese people chaotic and fussy. In turning to the Grand Canal, he wrote that the Chinese struggled for about 2 hours. Well, Charlie and his associates struggled for about 2 hours through the narrow streets of boats, amidst a perfect bedlam of shouts, cries, shrieks from infuriated boat women, infuriated at what? Never could make out. Apparently the world in general, and any unfortunate who happened to look at them in particular. Later in Hong Kong, Charlie found a few Japanese and joined heartily in disliking the Chinese. For the more I have seen and known of them, the more I dislike this cowardly, mean, money-grabbing nation. Though I must say I have met in Hong Kong a few Chinese who were not so very bad. It's interesting to compare Charlie's account in 1873 with Dana's description in 1860, as they traveled in some of the same places. They also knew each other very well, as Dana was a close friend of Henry Longfellow, and Dana's son was also married to Charlie's sister. While Dana was traveling at the height of the Taipei Rebellion, his account of China in 1860 was much more positive and light-hearted than Charlie's. There could be several factors leading to this difference. One reason was the continuing deterioration of the image of China in the United States. Another reason for Charlie's negative image of China was the deepening Western encroachment on Chinese society and the unequal treaties, and as a result, the increasing sentiments and violence against the foreigners in China, including the infamous Tianjin massacre in June 1870, when violence broke out due to the rumors of French missionaries kidnapping and mutilating Chinese children. It took place right around the time of Charlie's stay in China, and Charlie himself recorded that local Chinese calling him foreign devil and even throwing stone to him. In comparison, Dana described in 1860 that the local Chinese he met were curious about him, but very civil. Charlie's intensely negative account could also be a result of his personal background and the nature of his record, as he was a privileged Westerner who would not be used to the life in China, and he was also writing with no intention to publish his journal. So he could possibly write more direct and frankly in expressing his unrestrained feelings. Another reason in Charlie's remarkably negative view of China was the conscious contrast he constantly made between Japan and China, with Japan launching a quite successful reform at the time. The North American Review in the 1870s, in fact, published several articles written by Japanese authors, including one who traveled to Europe and the United States and studied these different nations. According to this Japanese traveler, Japan was fast changing. China changed a little, and the US hardly changed. As seen in its centuries-old constitution. Americans escaped the danger, I guess he was referring to the Civil War maybe, and then immediately forgot it, no change. Chinese take warnings, reflect a great deal, but don't change. French people never take warnings, do not reflect at all, but always change, according to this Japanese traveler. Well, this traveler, Japanese writer's view of the US and the comparison he made might not be accurate. His publication in the North American Review showed both the national pride of this Japanese traveler and Japanese in general, and the increasing American public attention to the changes in Japan, which could help explain the contrasting views of Japan and China among educated Americans such as Charlie. The deterioration of the image of China was best seen in the so-called Chinese question. The heated debate about the Chinese migrants in the US and their alleged threat to the Republic. So I have checked, examined the articles, particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, and I think they could be grouped in three categories with three positions. And the first article focused on the Chinese question was 1878, titled Chinese Immigration. It's very harsh. It adopted the scientific reasoning in justifying the exclusion of the Chinese, and argued that migration should not be just viewed as a moral issue, as Charles Sumner did, but need economic analysis and scientific analysis. Survival of the fittest often led to the survival of the inferior rather than the superior, according to this author. And the semi-civilized and the stationary Asiatics, a fifth in our field, would have threatened the nation. They were even more dangerous than freed slaves, as white Europeans had an advantage over the latter, who would not replace the white population. A more neutral position was espoused by Edward Self, who wrote in 1882, Why They Come. It provided the statistics of the immigration of different groups, including Chinese, and pointed out that while over 200,000 Chinese came by 1880, half of them returned to China. There were benefits of immigration as well as evils, and the evils were incidental rather than inherent, and they could be prevented. Immigration was important to the nation, and the author encouraged more Americanization of immigrants. The position most supportive of Chinese migration was held by George Seward, nephew of former Secretary of State William Seward, who signed the treaty with Burlingame, the so-called Burlingame Treaty. A career diplomat, George Seward served as the U.S. consul in Shanghai in 1861, staying in China for about 20 years, and he became the U.S. minister to China from 1876 to 1880. Based on his extensive experience in China, he refuted a broad array of accusations of Chinese migrants and opposed the restriction of Chinese from migration and their exclusion from naturalization. He argued that excluding them from voting was not different from that which was used regarding the Negro after the Civil War. Unfortunately, the growing and increasingly dominant voice, even in this prestigious and sophisticated literary journal, North American Review, was racial exclusion. Self, who held the relatively neutral position in his article in 1882, wrote two more articles in the 1880s. And the titles might be more revealing than the content. As you can see from the titles, the abuse of citizenship and the evil incidents to immigration. An article in 1886 emphasized the idea of racial purity and racial superiority of the Anglo-Saxon stock. An uttermost thought in the political mind of the age is the national importance of homogeneous population. The Negro question, too, remains unsolved. If this Chinese tide be allowed to keep flowing in, it will corrupt still more our ethnological hell broth, and add another and a notable element of disturbance. The three great families into which mankind is divided, black, yellow, white, the debasing effect of amalgamation across color lines indicate this, should develop within themselves and toward what apparently are their respective bounds, a half-civilized, civilized, and enlightened condition. End of quote. So that's what this article was describing the racial question at this time. Despite the deteriorating image of China in the U.S., the Chinese also took an active role in shaping the image, their own image. These efforts were at various levels. The Burlingame Mission was a government program that aimed at negotiating for better treaties with other powers and presenting China in a more positive light. The fan Longfellow received as a gift could be viewed as a gesture of friendship at both the personal and semi-official levels, kind of cultural diplomacy. As at a more private and a personal level, the first Chinese professor at Harvard also actively reached out to Longfellow, sharing his family photo with him and presenting a poem he wrote in tribute, paying tribute to this great poet. In the 1880s, the North American Review also published 2 articles written by Chinese migrants themselves. Interestingly, one criticizing American culture and defending Chinese tradition, and the other a rejoinder defending Christianity and justifying Chinese Americans' conversion into Christianity. Wang Qingfu, so the figure in the middle, the legendary Chinese American, publicly challenging Dennis Kearney for a duel. The person who instigated the violence in California, Dennis Kearney. So Wang Qingfu challenged him for a duel, and also Wang Qingfu unwaveringly fought for the rights of Chinese in America throughout his life. Compared in this essay, though, he compared the Confucian and the Christian ways of life, criticized the mistreatment of Chinese in the U.S., and questioned the many ironies and problems in American society, such as crimes, poverty, and the dysfunctional bureaucracy. Highlighting the Confucian virtues, he declared that he would proudly remain a heathen. In the next issue of the North American Review in 1887, Yanfu Li, or in Chinese Li Enfu, published a rejoinder. Li came to the U.S. in 1873 at the age of 12. As part of the Chinese education mission led by Yang Wing. He converted to Christianity 3 years later and graduated from Yale in 1887, the time when he wrote this essay. He could assign himself as a Christian, he said, because he was endowed with the faculty of reason, supplemented with formal logic and a desire to tell the truth. Li also mentioned the mistreatment of the Chinese in the U.S., but argued that the California legislature that passed various measures against the Chinese was not a Christian. The Santa Lauders were not Christians, even if they might call themselves so. If there is any sentiment in this country in favor of the Chinese today, it is only to be found in the Christian church, according to him. So for Li, a cosmopolitan view was more important than sticking to one's tradition. Quote, I flatter myself that I am broad and entertain cosmopolitan views. For while I glory in China's ancient civilization, her extensive literature, and lofty philosophy, I'm aware that other nations are superior to her in science and the arts. While I'm proud of China's philosophers, statesmen, and heroes, I can admit that other countries have also produced great men. End of quote. For Wang and Li, the North American Review became a rare and precious platform to raise their voice, supported by their own educational background and intellectual sharpness. While they clearly disagreed with each other, their debate and voice, in fact, broke the image of Chinese culture as inferior and submissive, and challenged the stereotype of the Chinese as monolithic and unassimilable. To summarize, based on the archives I have collected from the Longfellow House and studied them with the publications related to Longfellow's friends, and especially with the careful study of the coverage of China and the Chinese migrants in North American Review, this study shows the complex meanings of China to educated Americans, not an about-face or complete abandoning of positive and sympathetic views of China after the Opium War. Rather, there were constant support for China and the Chinese rights in the U.S., especially among American intellectuals aligned with the abolitionist cause. It reached its culmination in the 1860s with the Burlingame mission. Unfortunately, American perceptions of China continued to deteriorate and particularly intensified, worsened in the 1870s and the 1880s with the so-called Chinese question, though not unchallenged by Chinese intellectuals and migrants. I have to admit, this study at this moment is very, very preliminary, and there are many places where I can go deeper and discover more nuances of the sources that sources could help me. So more study to be done. I want to thank you for being so patient with such a long talk, I know. And I look forward to getting your questions and suggestions. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, yeah, please.
In the 19th century, I know some of the New England merchants had trade with China, among them a lot of Massachusetts permanent residents. They trade, they smuggling opium alongside with legal goods. And the result of opium trade in China was widespread addiction and the weakening of the whole nation. And today, for more than a decade, China has been shipping fentanyl to America. A lot of people here are addicted and die from that. History seems to repeat itself, but in reverse. What is your view about this? Is this a karmic retribution or something like that? Yeah.
That's a great question. Last year, Harvard Art Museums hosted a panel, whole program about this. Yeah, and I was a panelist, kind of invited by Sarah Lawson from the museum. I think that it's definitely tragic now, and it's a big issue that both nations should collaborate with each other to solve. But as a historian, I think there are still great differences. I think the historical context was very different. The opium trade was explicitly banned by the Chinese government from the 1820s up to 1830s, 1840s, and that's why I think, as I mentioned in my talk, even for general educated Americans, they view that as immoral, unethical. Not just for British merchants, but many American merchants participated in it. But somehow, many American merchants viewed that as not that serious. They viewed it just like a liquor. They didn't view that as a moral issue. So I think from the Chinese point of view, it's definitely devastating. It's definitely immoral and illegal, right? Because it's devastating to national economy, it's devastating to national health, and the effects were witnessed by foreigners themselves. And only one American company tried to stay away from the opium trade, based on what I read. I think for the fentanyl crisis right now, I haven't done deep research on this comparison, but I think that, again, the historical context was different. China was basically forced to open its door, and the opium trade was the prelude to a whole series of unequal treaties. But now I think the status, the United States is still one of the major powers in the world. And regarding how the fentanyl, the ingredients were shipped, exported to the United States, I think that the mechanism should be discussed and should be investigated. But I think the status, the national status regarding these two countries, quite different from the 19th century between China and Great Britain.
Two things. I might add that during your lecture, the art exhibit about addiction and the merchants were exploiting the Chinese for the beautiful treasures, porcelains, and that's in many museums in Massachusetts. The Freud's Museum, they all tied to China and the China trade and opium.
Mm-hmm.
So, but another question. It's interesting that the fan party, you had some of the most important abolitionists in the country at that party. Charles Sumner Charles Sumner lived right in Boston. He was a senator, but he was really a close friend of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very involved with the emancipation at that time. And then Mr. Henry Dana lived right behind us here. And he was also an attorney in helping all the fugitive slaves. So these two, it's interesting, they were at this party to celebrate this fan. Did they have sentiments for China? Is there anything in their writings you've read beyond? Because they were really, really involved in helping fugitive slaves in emancipation. Was something, you know, what their particular interest was with the Burlingame, the fan, the Chinese fan, beyond just interest in relic? Fan?
I think it's definitely a great intertwinement there.
Let's see the parallel
Yeah,
with the movements.
definitely.
Have you seen that written by them anywhere?
As I said, Dana wrote a very detailed account of his travel in
There's
China.
also letters in the archives here from Richard Dana during that trip to China, if you didn't see those.
I haven't.
So you published journals,
Right.
but there's letters that were acquired back in the late 90s of that trip. Letters from China to Cambridge. So
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah, that's one part I really want to have more time studying and then connecting the papers, because I think there's a very, very important inherent connection between the abolitionist cause and how they pursue the international collaboration and racial justice.
These
Not
guys
just
are
the
really
thing.
big, you know, in the abolitionist movement.
Yeah.
And to be at this party, you know, and what they said about it.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Are there lessons to be learned from the Burlingame mission of the 1860s that could be applied to the current situation where China-U.S. relations are at maybe an all-time low?
I hope so. There's so much to learn. I hope there will be another Anson Burlingame now in the United States. Yeah. Unfortunately, my observation is many American politicians tend to view China in a more Cold War framework, and many of them did not really go to China to travel. Of course, the major reason for that is the increasingly tumultuous, contentious relationship between the two countries. But that's exactly why people need to go to each other, to see, to talk to each other, and especially for lawmakers, for policymakers, that's so important. Anson Burlingame went to China when it was not a rosy picture at all, right? It's the 1860s. China was devastated by the domestic rebellion and foreign invasion, foreign influence. And Anson Burlingame was really, I think it's really made all efforts to understand the Chinese and then gain their trust. I think now, I hope the American leaders, American policymakers can avoid this ideological perspective and try to encourage, if not themselves, at least American maybe tourists or students especially go to China. And that's particularly alarming because only about a couple of hundreds of American students now in China. It's a dramatic decrease of American students studying in China compared to just a few years ago.
You mentioned, I think, the first instructor at Harvard who taught Chinese. But for them to become the instructor or professor, were they compelled to convert to Christianity? I know that was the case, for instance, for the first Jewish instructor, or at least a Hebrew at Harvard.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. In this case, in the case of this Chinese professor, it's a little different. Samuel Williams, the missionary who was in China for a long time, who wrote an account reviewed by the North American Review. When he came back, he became, the first professor on Chinese studies at Yale, around the same time, a little bit earlier than this Chinese professor in Harvard. The Chinese professor in Harvard was an interesting story because there's a Harvard alum in China at that time who were trying to recruit a person to come to the United States, to Harvard to teach. But it was not really easy because they need to raise funds, and there were a lot of barriers or obstacles in the process of raising enough funds for this person to come. And when he came, he was temporary. It's just a 3-year contract. So I think the temporary nature of this position might not lead to what we just suggested. Right? It's different from the other case. And this professor eventually died here at the end of his contract, unfortunately. So he really devoted his life, in that sense, to this very first Chinese language program at Harvard.
On that question on travel, didn't tourists start to travel under the Stuart Gardner weekly stopped in China in the end of the 19th century? People started to travel, but not as much as even Japan, but they were going to China. And have you looked at any of the diaries or letters from the travelers or what they were saying? I think it was a little more positive.
I have looked into Gardner's travel accounts, but in the 1870s and 1880s, I know former President Grant also traveled in China, and in that book, Kate recommended to me about a 20 months in Japan, about related to Charlie Longfellow. There's another chapter, in fact, making another book about former President Grant's travel in China. Also very pretty negative. So I think the image of China was pretty dark in the 1870s, 1880s.
I have a question about the fan itself and the gift to Longfellow. Longfellow was enormously popular in a way one of the rock stars would be today. In other words, poets aren't very famous in the United States anymore. So is the fan, I'm trying to understand this, does the fan have great significance, or is it just like a gift you would give a friend? I'm trying to understand within the context of the 1800s what the fan would signify.
That's a great question. I think this fan was quite unique.
Yeah.
It was very, very unique because it was translated not directly from the English, but from another version by, I think it's a British diplomat in China. So it's a retranslation. But the whole meaning of the fan for this vice foreign minister in China was about, I think, showing appreciation and showing his personal appreciation of the poem and the poet. And also he could ask Anson Burlingame to bring the fan to Longfellow. So I think this personal relationship mattered a lot. It's not just a casual personal gift, but I think there is some deep sense of mission, I think, on the part of the Chinese scholar official, that this could be a symbol of the two nations. Because, again, the U.S. was viewed very positively. Anson Burlingame might represent one of the most respected American figures in China. The United States, literally, in Chinese is 美国, which means a beautiful country. Right? So there has been this very interesting, special understanding among the Chinese of the United States that this country has been very hospitable to China, very supportive, and quite often would try to maintain China's territorial integrity. Of course, that's the diplomatic negotiations. It's much more complicated in historical context. But the United States, I think the image of the U.S. in China has been quite often very positive and romanticized. And that's why I also use the title here. It's very interesting. China has been called by Americans as the flowery kingdom. And the United States, the flag is a flower flag. It's a star and spangled banner, right? But for the Chinese, it's called a flower flag. So I think that shows something very intimate on both sides. They view each other with this perception, romanticizing each other and view each other in a very positive way, historically speaking. But of course, it's not always up to the reality.
Quick question.
Sorry, go ahead.
That wonderful picture you showed with Burlingame in the center, everyone was holding things. What did those signify?
Which one?
Here.
Oh, that's true.
And that's why
Great observation.
I'm not sure that
Great observation.
prior to that was, what do those things symbolize?
This
Why
might
are
go
they
back. Yeah, might go back to your question.
Yes.
This is a cultural symbol because I'm not an expert on traditional China, but a fan is something very personal and very cultural. It's like your status. It's like a symbol of your cultural integrity or your social status. And with the poem on it, with the poem translated from English to Chinese, and then from a former version of the poem to another version of the poem, I think it really meant something to the Chinese scholar official once they did this and then sent it to Longfellow. I think maybe we can get the question from the yes.
In Chinese culture and at the time, was the fan like a common gift that people gave to one another, or was it reserved for something unique? And how often were messages written on fans? Like one that was given?
Yeah, I think again that's a great question. I wish I knew more about that. I'm not an expert on the fan, but personally, I think when I was brought up, this could be something very personal. Again, I think it's a symbol of your cultural identity. That's why I think for this even junior scholar officials, this team, they would hold the fan. But I don't know whether they were aware of the connection between their fan and the fan Senator Longfellow. I doubt it. But that's a great connection there. That's a great observation. Yeah, I think it's just a way how traditional scholar officials they use fan as easily to carry, right, with them, and also to represent the cultural identity, cultural status. This is not a good answer at all because I'm not an expert.
And
Sorry,
there is no AC, so that.
That's not easy, yes. Yeah, that's the
Really,
practical
yeah.
function, of course.
Practice and also
Yeah.
the art.
Yeah, definitely. But quite often there will be calligraphy there. So again, so it's for both for practical purpose and for cultural status.
Longfellow was world famous.
Yeah.
And he was, not many American literature people were known in China at the time, but Longfellow was known. And the poem that was translated called Sound of Life, it was a spiritual poem for people. And I think it meant a lot. And this was a big deal. It was a diplomatic gathering between China and America. Longfellow was a famous, and maybe more so than most any American at the time. So it was a really big deal, this gathering, fan party. He also wrote an anthology of poems of places, including poems of China.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I saw that information in the archives.
There's a lot of connections, more, which we could talk about time, but even the 19th century, Andrew Craigie, right, lived in the house.
Right.
There's Chinese wallpaper on the walls from the 18th century, Chinese typical fence. It's so much there. It's called Chinoiserie.
Right.
So it's just a very big story, I think.
Right. And the fans were very popular, as you said, among the general, the products, China trade.
Yeah.
They were transported here and then could be bought by average Americans. So it's a great symbol of the Chinese culture. And Longfellow also mentioned in his letters that he liked the book, the poems of other places. Yeah. And he once wrote in his, I think, diary or letter saying, "I wish we could travel now to China, to India, enjoy the tea, find the herb." So he was fascinated by these different places. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, I see two more questions, 2 or 3, and then we'll.
Okay.
The only question is, where's the fan? I keep hoping
Right there, right there.
I keep hoping you're gonna whip it out there.
It's too precious to be here because it
I
used to
figured
be.
that David probably has it under lock and case. But it would be nice to see it someday.
I know. Yeah, it's so precious. I would say it's really a national treasure.
Yes.
Yeah, not just a treasure here, not for the heart, but a national treasure. Okay, please. And then
So-
we'll go back.
You have a quote up there, I don't know from who visited China and then equated China with America, province and the states and democracy. And so that addresses the question of the U.S. versus China countries, but another way of looking at things is at that period of time of the Chinese question, China, like a lot of other countries, sent people here to people the U.S. to populate it, and so I wonder to what extent China was maybe because of the established powers that were already here, and they were more familiar with like other Europeans, right? I mean, they I'm thinking, let's say the Irish who suffered famine, they sent people over. A lot of the Chinese, in the 19th century, a lot of them were from southern China, also suffered famine and flooding and all this stuff. I wonder to what extent that the powers that be that were here were less familiar with China. They're like a natural foreigner. They were held to a higher standard. Like, no one said, well, maybe they did. I'm not sure. I'm asking you the question. Did they perceive other Europeans who were coming here around that time or slightly later as being like less than human? Which was the discourse that it ended up being, and because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So my question is, was China and the Chinese held to somewhat a higher standard because of the unfamiliarity of the Americans with China being further away?
You mean for the person who said this? This is
not this one. This one is a different way. This is more like countries, like how countries are relating to each other, as opposed to the question of who's available and acceptable to immigrate into the U.S. in the 19th century and early 20th century. You know, like, and why was, you know, and the Chinese question and the views of Americans of the Chinese as being, you know, in some respects subhuman, you know, how that came to be, and whether you've had any, you know, comparisons researching like the treatment of other people who came to this country, also because they were suffering from, you know, less ideal conditions. You know, there's a push-pull of immigration and emigration. So, you know, that's.
Yeah, I think it's definitely there are similarities but also differences regarding how different ethnic groups, different immigrant groups were treated in the U.S. In the mid-19th century, the Irish, when they came, they were also very much stereotyped and discriminated against. And later, Italians and also German immigrants too. But the difference, I think, is the racial identity. So they would be allowed to naturalize to become white, but the Chinese and other Asians would become forever foreigners, starting from the beginning. So I think that this racial barrier existed and played a huge role in defining who belonged, who didn't belong to the United States. Right? So that's a very major difference between Chinese and Asian migrants and European migrants. I taught an American immigration history class, so I usually talk with the students about the changing laws from the naturalization law in the 1790s for example, to the law in after the Civil War, but it did not expand to include Asians, as we just mentioned in the talk. And even the 1924 Immigration Act started to restrict European migrants, but it's still restriction rather than exclusion. The Asians were basically excluded from coming to the U.S. and becoming Americans. So the legal dimension is very, very, very crucial. Thanks for that question. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Let's see. I'd like to add to what you said. Or I remember at some point you said, or you were quoting someone who had mentioned like the three races: black, yellow, and white. And I think that's, you know, if you're from Europe, you're still white. Whereas, you know, if you are from Asia, then you are not in that category, which, you know, messes with things. But what I wanted to ask is, I've noticed with TikTok, for example, shortly after the first TikTok ban was enacted, a lot of Americans were very upset, and they moved to an app called Red Note. Have you heard of it? Yeah. So, and I've never interacted with either TikTok or Red Note, but I heard that like people, or I guess Chinese people and Americans were like on the same server and able to interact with each other, and people were like finding out just a bunch of different things about the each other's countries
and the living cost. And it's shocking for many Americans to know, wow, the tuition in China is so low. The college tuition.
Oh yeah. And I haven't ever been to China, but once a bunch of Chinese grad students from Fudan and Xianhua came over, and just interacting with them, like I learned, or I just deduced so many different things about China and Chinese culture. And I was just wondering, since things are not, the international relationship is not currently that great between America and China, it's a little bit of an understatement. How can people do stuff like this? How can maybe like scholars or even ordinary people like reach out? How can I send a fan to China?
That's a great question. That's so timely, so critical for our moment. I think my best hope is they can encourage students to visit each other's universities, and they can invite scholars from each other to have more conversations, which is why it's very alarming now. It has been several years. Chinese social scientists, Chinese scholars, when they try to come to the U.S., they would in fact be faced with many questions and embarrassment at the immigration service at the border. And Chinese media, I have read many stories about their being embarrassed, being humiliated, or being sometimes even denied the entry. And that's even worse here in the U.S. now with the so-called China initiative, when the government is trying to find spies for foreign governments, and quite often they target Chinese American scientists. So the China initiative was started during the first Trump administration, and it was ended during the Biden administration. And now people are worried that it will start again during this administration. Hopefully not, because it will really not just hurt the Chinese Americans, but also the Americans themselves, right? The American national interest, because we need scientists, we need this skilled, talented people to contribute to your economy and to be working in a very safe and trustworthy environment. Yeah, it's just a couple of hundreds of American students now in China, and that's really, really alarming. And in comparison, many Chinese students are still in the U.S. But I think because of this tension and this anxiety now, many Chinese students might be rethinking whether they should come to the U.S. They might go to the other countries to study. So that's another thing we need to be worried about. Yeah. Thanks. So thank you so much.